In the dust-choked streets of Red Rock, 5 ruthless outlaws are about to learn a deadly lesson. When the notorious Raven Gang swaggers into the Silver Dollar Saloon, they think they're dealing with just another small-town drunk at the bar. They couldn't be more wrong. James "Ghost" Hawkins isn't your typical aging cowboy. For 20 years, he was the most feared lawman in the Western Territories, with more notches on his gun than most men have stories to tell. They called him Ghost, because once he drew his weapon, dead men were all that remained. This isn't just another tale of Western justice. This is the story of how the deadliest gang west of the Mississippi learned the hard way that some legends never fade. When they threatened his peaceful town, they didn't realize they were poking a sleeping bear. What follows is the story of how one retired marshal would end a reign of terror in just 5 minutes, using nothing but 2 six-shooters, decades of experience, and the lightning-fast reflexes that made him a legend. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dawn painted the Arizona sky in shades of blood and gold as James Hawkins walked the quiet streets of Red Rock. His spurs clinked softly against the wooden sidewalk, a sound that once made hardened outlaws tremble. At 62, he still moved, with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, his weathered hand never far from the worn Colt at his hip. The townsfolk called him Mr. Hawkins now, most too young to remember when he was known simply as Ghost. Only old-timers like Doc Wilson still recalled the stories. How he could draw and fire before most men cleared leather, how he'd cleaned up Tombstone when no other marshal would touch it, how he'd tracked the notorious Carson brothers through 3 territories and brought them back dead or alive, mostly dead. These days, he lived quietly above the general store, spending his mornings drinking coffee on the porch and his evenings nursing whiskey at the Silver Dollar. But those who looked closely could see it in his eyes. The watchfulness, the coiled readiness of a predator pretending to be tame. "Morning, Mr. Hawkins," young Tommy Wilson called out, sweeping the doctor's porch. The boy's eyes lingered on Hawkins's gun, the same way they had every morning for the past 5 years. "Tommy," Hawkins nodded, his voice gravel over silk. He'd watched the boy grow up, along with most of Red Rock's young ones. This town had given him something he'd never found in all his years wearing a badge: peace. Inside the general store, Sarah Mitchell was already setting up for the day. Her husband had been one of the few who recognized Hawkins when he first rode into town. "Coffee's fresh," she said, not looking up from her ledger. "And there's talk of riders coming from the south, bad ones." Hawkins poured his coffee, the rich aroma mixing with the scent of leather and tobacco that filled the store. "Riders come and go," he said quietly, but his eyes had turned hard as flint. "These are different," Sarah insisted. 3 men stopped at Thompson's ranch yesterday, asked about the town, about who lives here. She paused, meeting his gaze. "Asked if we had a marshal." Hawkins sipped his coffee, remembering other mornings like this, in other towns. How they always started with whispers, with rumors of approaching trouble, how they usually ended with graves being dug. "Raven Gang," old Doc Wilson said from the doorway, his medical bag in hand. "Word is they've been working their way north, hitting every town between here and the Mexican border. Banks mostly, but they don't leave witnesses." The name stirred something in Hawkins' memory, 10 years ago before he'd hung up his badge. A shootout in El Paso. 5 dead outlaws, but their leader had escaped. A man with eyes like death and a raven tattooed on his gun hand. "Town's got no law now," Doc continued, watching Hawkins carefully. "Marshal Peters retired last month. Deputy's just a boy." "I'm retired too," Hawkins said softly. But his hand had drifted to his gun, fingers tracing the worn grip with the familiarity of an old love. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning shadows. But darker shadows were approaching. Red Rock, carried on horseback by men who dealt in death. Men who didn't know that the deadliest gunman in the territories was sitting quietly in a general store, drinking coffee and pretending he'd forgotten how to kill. Tommy Wilson burst in, out of breath. "Riders coming, 4. No, 5 of them, all in black, leading spare horses." Hawkins set down his coffee cup, the liquid inside still as glass. The store had gone quiet, every eye on him. They'd accepted him as the quiet man who kept to himself, who helped fix porches and taught kids to ride. Now they were remembering who he really was, what he was capable of. "Sarah," he said quietly, "might want to close up early today." His boot heels echoed on the wooden floor as he walked out, straight-backed and steady. The morning sun cast his shadow long across the street, the shadow of a ghost that 5 foolish men were about to meet. The midday sun found Hawkins at Miller's stable, helping the old man shoe a nervous mare. His coat hung on a peg, gun belt still buckled around his waist. 5 years of peace hadn't changed some habits. A man who'd survived as long as he had. Didn't let his guard down, even while doing honest work. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice carrying the same gentle tone that had once talked desperate men out of suicide charges. The mare settled under his touch, just like they all did. Animals sense things about people, always had. They knew who they could trust, who carried death in their hands. "Don't know how you do it, Hawkins," Miller said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Been trying to shoe this one for 2 days, mean as a rattler with everyone else." Hawkins didn't reply, focused on the task. His hands, which had ended more lives than he cared to count, now moved with delicate precision, careful not to spook the horse. It was the kind of quiet work he'd come to appreciate these past years. Simple, honest, clean. Young Deputy Williams appeared at the stable entrance, casting a nervous shadow. Fresh-faced and eager, barely 22, reminded Hawkins of himself, before the badge had burned its weight into his soul. "Mr. Hawkins, got a minute?" Hawkins nodded, patting the mare's flank before straightening. His back protested. Time was catching up, even if his reflexes hadn't noticed yet. "Those riders Doc mentioned," Williams shifted his weight, gun belt too new on his hips. "They're camped at Thompson's Creek, been asking questions about the bank, about the town's defenses." "Town's got you," Hawkins said mildly, washing his hands in a water bucket. "Town's got a boy playing at being a man," Williams replied, showing a flash of self-awareness that impressed Hawkins. "Everyone knows it. When trouble comes, real trouble, they don't look to me. They look at you, even if you don't wear the badge anymore." The truth of it hung heavy in the air. Hawkins had seen it growing these past weeks, the way folks watched him waiting, the way they measured their words when speaking of trouble, gauging his reactions. They'd accepted his quiet life, but they hadn't forgotten what he was. "Got her. Telegraph from Marshal Davis in Tucson," Williams continued. "Says the Raven gang hit Copper Springs 3 days ago. 6 dead, including the sheriff. Bank robbed, but..." He hesitated. "That wasn't all they did. Women taken, buildings burned. They're not just thieves, Mr. Hawkins. They're something worse." Hawkins dried his hands slowly, memories stirring like dust devils in his mind. El Paso. The tattooed hand. Holding a gun. The smile that hadn't touched those dead eyes. "Town's got a deputy," he repeated firmly, but his voice had changed, carrying an edge that made Williams step back instinctively. As if summoned by the conversation, Sarah Mitchell's daughter Emma ran up, her pigtails bouncing. "Mr. Hawkins, Mama says to remind you about supper tonight. She's making your favorite, beef stew." The contrast struck him hard. This innocent life he'd built, weekly dinners with the Mitchells, teaching Emma to ride her pony, helping Miller with his horses, all of it balanced against the approaching storm of violence that had followed him his whole life. "Tell your mama I'll be there," he said softly, watching Emma skip away. Williams lingered, clearly wanting to say more, but knowing better. Later, walking back to his room above the store, Hawkins noted how the town had changed since morning. Doors closed a little quicker at his approach. Conversations hushed. They were remembering the stories, the legends, preparing themselves for what they feared was coming. At his door he paused, looking down the dusty main street. 5 years he'd lived here. 5 years of peace, of trying to forget the weight of the gun on his hip, of pretending he was just another aging cowboy who'd found a quiet place to rest. But peace, he knew better than most, was as fragile as morning mist. And sometimes keeping it meant remembering how to be the ghost that haunted other men's nightmares. Supper at the Mitchells should have been peaceful. Sarah's beef stew filled the house with warmth and memory, her table set with the fine china she'd brought west from Boston. But tension rode shotgun at the meal, heavy as trail dust in the air. "Bank's moving extra cash in tomorrow," John Mitchell said, trying to sound casual as he passed the cornbread. "Stage arrival at noon." His eyes met Hawkins across the table, carrying unspoken weight. "Seems unwise," Hawkins replied quietly, "spreading word about money shipments." "Wasn't spread," Sarah interjected, her knuckles white around her fork. "Telegraph operator mentioned it to exactly 3 people. By sundown, whole town knew." Emma pushed peas around her plate, too young to understand the adult's concern, but old enough to feel it. "Mr. Hawkins, will you still teach me to shoot tomorrow?" The question landed like a hammer blow. Sarah's breath caught, John's hand frozen mid-reach for his coffee. They'd asked Hawkins to teach Emma 3 months ago, wanting her to handle a gun properly. Now the lessons carried different meaning. "If your mama agrees," Hawkins said carefully, watching Sarah's face. "She needs to know," Sarah whispered, her voice steel beneath silk. "If those men come—" The meal's peace shattered completely when Doc Wilson burst in, not bothering to knock. "They've hit Sweetwater," he announced, face grim. "Just got the wire, bank robbed, 3 dead, marshal, deputy, and the preacher who tried to stop them." Hawkins set down his fork, noting how the others unconsciously leaned away. His stillness had changed, become something predatory. "Sweetwater's 4 hours' ride," he observed. "That's not all," Doc continued, accepting the coffee Sarah pressed into his trembling hands. "They left a message, carved it into the marshal's chest before they strung him up." He glanced at Emma, hesitating. "Emma, time for bed," Sarah said quickly. The girl started to protest, but stopped at her mother's expression. After Emma's footsteps faded upstairs, Doc continued. "Message said, 'Red Rock next. Ghost can't hide forever.'" The room went silent as a grave. John's face had gone pale, Sarah's hand covering her mouth. They were all looking at Hawkins now, whose expression hadn't changed except for a dangerous glitter in his eyes. "They're not coming for the bank," he said softly. "They're coming for me." "You know them?" John asked. But it wasn't really a question. "Their leader, Jacob Raven," Hawkins' voice carried death in it now. "El Paso, 10 years back. He was running with the Cortez gang then. I took them down, but he escaped. Lost 4 good men in that fight. And now he's coming to finish it. Docky said, no." Hawkins stood, his chair scraping like a coffin lid closing. "He's coming to die. He just doesn't know it yet." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Sarah reached for him, grabbed his arm. "James," she said, using his first name for the first time in 5 years. "You're not that man anymore. You don't have to be. Never stop being him." Hawkins replied gently, "Just got better at hiding it." He looked at John. "Get your family out of town. Tomorrow morning early. Take anyone who'll go with you." "And you?" John asked, already knowing the answer. "I'll do what I've always done." Hawkins moved to the door, his shadow stretched long by lamplight. "I'll give evil men what they're asking for." Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. A storm was coming, but not the kind that brought rain. This storm would water the earth with blood, and at its center would be a ghost that 5 foolish men had wakened from his rest. "James," Sarah called after him. He paused but didn't turn. "Whatever happens, you gave us 5 years of peace. Remember that." Hawkins nodded once and stepped into the gathering dark. Tomorrow would bring violence back into his life like an old lover returning, but tonight he had preparations to make. A ghost needed to get ready for haunting. The Silver Dollar Saloon had gone quiet as a church at midnight. 5 black-clad figures filled the doorway, backlit by the setting sun, casting long shadows across the sawdust floor. Every eye in the place fixed on them, then quickly looked away, all except for one pair belonging to the grey-haired man at the corner of the bar, whose whiskey glass had stopped halfway to his lips. Jacob Raven entered first, his presence spreading through the room like poison in a water well. The raven tattoo on his gun hand seemed to writhe with each movement, its beak open in a silent scream. Behind him came his killers, Stone-Faced Jones, the Weber twins, and a mountain of a man they called Bear. "Whiskey," Raven announced, his voice soft as a rattler's warning. "Leave the bottle." The bartender, Old Pete, moved with shaking hands. 5 years tending bar in Red Rock hadn't prepared him for men like these. The bottle clinked against the bar like chattering teeth. "Heard tell," Raven continued, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that a ghost lives in this town, man they used to call the fastest gun in the territories." His dead eyes swept the room, lingering on each face. "Anyone seen such a spirit lately?" Silence answered him. In his corner, Hawkins took another slow sip of whiskey, his face hidden by the brim of his hat. His right hand rested easily on the bar, inches from his gun. 5 years of peace had taught him patience. "Let them make the first. Move." The Weber twins spread out, pushing chairs aside with their boots. Bear loomed by the door, blocking the exit. Stone-Faced Jones started checking faces, moving through the crowd like a wolf shopping for lamb. "Maybe." Raven pulled out a chair, the scrape against wooden floors making people flinch. "We need to help jog some memories." He nodded to Bear, who grabbed young Tommy Wilson from his table, dragging him center stage. "Now then, boy," Raven smiled, the expression never touching his eyes. "Tell me about James Hawkins." Tommy's face went white as fresh linen. His eyes, like everyone else's, flickered toward the corner of the bar. But Hawkins hadn't moved, hadn't even looked up from his drink. I don't..." Tommy stammered. Raven's hand shot out, faster than a snake strike, grabbing Tommy's throat. "Let me be clear, boy. I'm going to start breaking fingers until someone points me toward the ghost. 1 digit at a time, nice and slow. Might take all night, but I've got patience." "That's enough." The words fell soft as falling snow, but they froze every soul in the room. Hawkins set down his glass with deliberate care, still not looking up. Well, well," Raven's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "The ghost speaks." He released Tommy, who scrambled away. 5 years I've been looking for you, Hawkins. 5 years planning how to make you suffer before you die." "Let the boy go," Hawkins said quietly. "Clear the saloon. This is between us." "No," Raven's voice turned playful. "I don't think I will. In fact," he nodded to his men, who drew their guns, "I think everyone here gets to watch, gets to see how the mighty ghost bleeds." Finally, Hawkins looked up. His eyes, when they met Raven's, carried the same cold emptiness they'd held in El Paso. The look that had haunted Raven's nightmares for a decade. "Last chance," Hawkins said, each word measured and final. "Walk away. Take your men and ride out, or in 5 minutes I'll send you all to hell." Laughter erupted from the gang, but it carried an edge of uncertainty. Something in Hawkins' voice, in the casual way he sat unmoving despite 5 guns aimed his way, made their trigger fingers twitch. 5 minutes?" Raven sneered, drawing his own gun. "You won't last 5 seconds, old man. Times have changed. You're just a relic, a story mothers tell their children." 4 minutes, 50 seconds, Hawkins replied calmly, turning back to his whiskey. "Clock's ticking." Time moved like molasses in January as Hawkins sipped his whiskey. The Webber twins circled wide, trying to flank him. Bear's massive frame still blocked the door, while stone-faced Jones kept his gun trained on the crowd. Raven hadn't moved, his tattooed hand resting on his holstered gun. 4 minutes, Hawkins announced quietly. You know what I did in Sweetwater? Raven's voice carried a serpent's pleasure. After I carved your name in the marshal's chest, I visited his wife. Lovely woman, screamed real pretty. Hawkins's finger tapped once against his glass, the only sign that he'd heard. Copper Springs. Was better, though, Raven continued, watching for any reaction. Found a man there who knew you, said you'd saved his life once, made sure he died slow. Thinking about that. 3 minutes, 30 seconds. The saloon had gone tomb silent. Even the drunks in the corner held their breath. Everyone could feel it building, something terrible and inevitable as an approaching storm. Your friend Sarah. Raven's smile turned. Cruel. She's got a pretty daughter, doesn't she? Emma, right? Sweet girl. Waves to everyone from that porch of hers. Been watching her all week. The glass in Hawkins' hand cracked. There it is, Raven laughed. The ghost has feelings after all. What's wrong, Hawkins? Age making you soft? Time was you'd have drawn already. Now look at you, hiding behind a whiskey glass while I threaten children. 3 minutes. Raven's patience snapped. He slammed his hand on the bar next to Hawkins. Draw, damn you! Draw, or I start killing these people one by one. To demonstrate, he spun and fired. The bullet took old Pete in the shoulder, sending him crashing into his bottles. Women screamed. Someone started crying. 2 minutes, 30 seconds, Hawkins said, voice unchanged. But his eyes, when they met Raven's, had turned to blue ice. Boss, Stone-faced Jones called out, nervousness creeping into his tone. Something about Hawkins' stillness was getting to him. Maybe we should— Shut up, Raven roared. He grabbed young Tommy again, pressing his gun to the boy's head. Draw your weapon, Ghost, or the boy dies right here. Let him go, Jacob. For the first time, something deadly crept into Hawkins' voice. You want me. These people have nothing to do with it. They have everything to do with it. Raven's eyes had gone wild. You took everything from me in El Paso, my gang, my reputation, my future. Now I'm going to take everything from you, starting with this town's innocence. He squeezed the trigger slightly, making Tommy whimper. 2 minutes, Hawkins said softly. Boss? One of the Webber twins shifted uneasily. Something ain't right. He's too calm. He's old, Raven spat. Weak, living soft these past years while we've been— 1 minute, 30 seconds. The steady count was getting to them all now. Bear had started sweating. The Webber twins kept looking at each other, then the door. Even stone-faced Jones had backed up a step. You're dead, Hawkins. Raven screamed, spittle flying. You hear me? Dead! I'm going to kill everyone in this town. Burn it to the ground. Salt the earth. 1 minute. Raven shoved Tommy aside and strode to Hawkins, pressing his gun directly against the older man's temple. Draw your weapon, you coward. Draw or die right here. Hawkins finally turned, meeting Raven's gaze fully. Something in those eyes made the outlaw take a step back. 30 seconds, Hawkins said, standing slowly. Still time to walk away. Kill. Him, Raven ordered his men. Kill him now. Time's up. The words fell like a judge's gavel. In that moment, everyone in the Silver Dollar Saloon realized they were about to witness something both terrible and magnificent. They were about to see why, even after 5 years of peace, men still spoke of the ghost in whispers. What happened next would be talked about in Red Rock for generations. 5 seconds that became legend, passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, each telling adding to the myth of the man they called Ghost. The first second belonged to Raven. His finger tightened on the trigger, gun still pressed to Hawkins' temple. But that's when Hawkins moved, and everyone learned why they'd called him Ghost. He wasn't there anymore. Like smoke in a strong wind, he simply ceased to be where he had been. Raven's bullet shattered the mirror behind the bar, and then hell. itself broke loose in the Silver Dollar Saloon. The second belonged to the Weber twins. They were fast, had to be to survive this long. Their guns cleared leather in a blur of motion, but Hawkins was already moving. His first shot took the left twin's gun hand, spinning him into his brother. His second shot disarmed the right twin before either could fire a round. The second was Stone-Faced Jones's last. He managed to get off 2 shots, both missing, as Hawkins seemed to flow between them like water through fingers. Hawkins' return fire was surgical, 1 bullet to the shoulder, sending Jones crashing through a table. In the 4th second, Bear made his move. The giant rushed forward, trying to use his size. Hawkins' gun barked once, kneecapping him. The big man went down roaring, his own wild shot hitting nothing but ceiling. The final second belonged to Raven and Hawkins alone. Time seemed to slow. As they faced each other, 2 legends of the Old West having their final dance. Raven was fast, faster than any man Hawkins had faced in years. His gun came up in a blur of motion, the Raven tattoo seeming to take flight, but Hawkins was faster, had always been faster. His last shot caught Raven's gun arm at the elbow, spinning him like a top. The Outlaw's unfired bullet buried itself in the floorboards as he collapsed. 5 seconds, 5 shots, 5 men down, all still breathing, all disarmed with surgical precision. Hawkins stood in the center of the chaos, gun still smoking, having never moved from his spot at the bar. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wounded men seemed too shocked to make a sound. Hawkins calmly ejected his spent shells, reloading with the smooth precision of a man who'd done it 10,000 times. "Should have walked away," he said quietly, looking down at Raven, who clutched his shattered elbow. "Told you what would happen." "How?" Raven gasped, his face pale with pain and shock. "You're old. Retired." "Some things," Hawkins replied, "you never forget. Like the proper way to end a fight." He turned to the stunned crowd. "Someone fetch Doc Wilson. These men need medical attention before they face justice." Young Tommy Wilson, who'd witnessed it all from behind an overturned table, found his voice first. "Mr. Hawkins, that was... I've never... What you saw," Hawkins cut him off gently, "was the last echo of a dying age. Something that belongs in the past, where I aim to keep it." He looked around the saloon, at the familiar faces that now stared at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "This isn't who I am anymore. But sometimes who you were is exactly who you need to be." Deputy Williams burst in, gun drawn, responding to the shots far too late. He took in the scene, 5 notorious outlaws down, none dead, and Hawkins calmly holstering his weapon. "I'll need help getting them to the jail," Hawkins told him. "And send a telegram to Marshal Davis in Tucson. Tell him the Raven gang won't be troubling anyone else." As the deputy organized the locals to help move the prisoners, Hawkins finally finished his whiskey. The ghost of violence lingered in his eyes, but it was fading, like morning mist burned away by sun. He'd crossed a line tonight, stepped back into a world he'd tried to leave behind. The question now was whether Red Rock would let him return to being just Mr. Hawkins, the quiet man who helped shoe horses and taught children to ride. Or would they forever see him as the ghost, the legend who could end a fight in 5 seconds flat without taking a single life? Doc Wilson's office had never been so crowded. 5 wounded outlaws occupied every available space, their groans mixing with the creak of wooden floors and the clink of medical instruments. Hawkins stood by the window, watching the street where townsfolk gathered in whispered clusters, stealing glances at the doctor's office. "You could have killed them all," Doc said quietly, finishing the bandage on Stone-Faced Jones's shoulder. "Should have, some might say, after what they did in Sweetwater." "Death's easy," Hawkins replied, his voice distant. "Living with what you've done, that's the real punishment." In the corner, Raven laughed bitterly despite his shattered elbow. Still playing the righteous lawman ghost? Tell them about El Paso. Tell them what you did to my brother." The room went silent. Doc's hand stilled over his patient. Deputy Williams, standing guard at the door, leaned forward slightly. "Your brother," Hawkins said without turning, "drew on a saloon girl. Shot her dead for spilling his drink. He was 16. Raven's voice cracked. "Just a kid running wild. You could have taken him alive." Now Hawkins did turn, his eyes hard as granite. "He'd killed 3 people by then. The girl made 4. When I cornered him, he used a child as a shield." The ghost of old pain crossed his face. "Sometimes death is the kindest outcome." "You enjoyed it," Raven spat. "I saw your face when you pulled that trigger, the great ghost dealing out justice, like he was God himself." "No." Hawkins moved closer, each step deliberate. "I've never enjoyed killing. Not once in 30 years of wearing a badge. Every death, justified or not, takes a piece of your soul. That's something you never understood, Jacob. Why you and your kind are nothing but rabid dogs that need to be put down," says the man who just crippled 5 men without blinking. Says, "The man who gave you a chance to walk away." Hawkins's voice carried the weight of decades. "I could have killed you 10 years ago, could have killed you tonight. Instead, I gave you something worse, the chance to live with your failures." The door opened, admitting Sarah Mitchell. She carried a basket of bandages, but her eyes were fixed on Hawkins. The look held something new. Not fear, exactly, but a deeper understanding of what lay beneath his quiet exterior. "James," she said softly, using his first name again. "Town council's meeting. They want to talk to you. About offering me the marshal's badge, I expect." His tone was resigned. "Now that they've seen what I can do, they'll want the ghost to protect them. We've always known what you could do," Sarah replied. "That's not why they want you. It's because of what you didn't do tonight. Any other man would have killed them all and been justified. You chose a harder path." Raven laughed again, but this time it held a note of dawning comprehension. "Now I understand. You're not staying peaceful for yourself. You're doing it for them. For this town of weak." His words cut off as Hawkins moved faster than thought. Suddenly he was looming over Raven, and everyone in the room remembered why men once spoke his name in whispers. "Careful," Hawkins said softly. "These weak people took me in, gave me a home when I was nothing but a tired old gunman with 2 many ghosts. They deserve better than to be judged by a man who preys on the innocent." Doc Wilson cleared his throat. "Marshal Davis will be here tomorrow to collect them. Tucson's got enough evidence to hang them all." "Good." Hawkins stepped back, the deadly presence fading like mist. "Then justice will be served proper through the law, the way it should be." As he turned to leave, Raven called after him. "You can't escape what you are, Ghost. The violence is in your blood. These people saw it tonight. They'll never trust you the same way again." Hawkins paused at the door. "Maybe, but trust isn't about never seeing someone's darkness. It's about knowing they choose light anyway." He looked at Sarah, saw understanding in her eyes. 5 years of peace against 30 years of violence. Maybe it's time the scales tipped the other way. Outside, the setting sun painted Red Rock in shades of gold and shadow. The townsfolk still gathered, but now they straightened as Hawkins emerged, not with fear, but with respect. They'd seen the ghost of violence that lived within him, and they'd seen him choose mercy over vengeance. Some legends, Hawkins reflected, were built on blood, but maybe the greatest legends were built on the choice not to spill it. The town hall meeting that evening felt more like a church revival. Every seat was filled, with people standing along the walls and spilling out onto the porch. Hawkins stood at the back, hat in hands, while Mayor Collins addressed the crowd from behind his podium. 5 years ago, the mayor's voice carried clear through the packed room, a stranger rode into Red Rock, asked for nothing but a quiet place to rest. Since then, James Hawkins has been a model citizen. Fixed our fences, Helped our children, never asked for recognition or reward. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah Mitchell, sitting with her family in the front row, kept her eyes on Hawkins. Tonight, Collins continued, we learned that man was something more, the legendary Ghost, a name that struck fear into outlaws across 3 territories. A man who could have killed 5 dangerous criminals in the blink of an eye, but chose instead to show mercy. Mercy, a voice called out. Samuel Peterson, the banker. Those men killed innocent people, terrorized whole towns. Maybe mercy wasn't what they deserved. That's exactly why they got it. Hawkins spoke for the first time, his quiet voice somehow carrying over the crowd. Kill a rabid dog, you end its suffering. Let it live with its madness. That's the harder punishment. The room fell silent, pondering his words. Young Tommy Wilson stood up, still showing bruises from his ordeal at the saloon. I saw it, he announced proudly. Saw him take down all 5 before you could blink, like something out of a dime novel, only real. That's the problem, Peterson pressed. We've got a living legend here, the fastest gun in the territories, and he's been hiding, pretending to be just another aging cowboy. How do we know we can trust enough? Sarah Mitchell's voice cut through the debate like a knife. She stood facing the crowd. Trust. For 5 years, this man has proven himself worthy of our trust every single day. Not by showing us his gun, but by showing us his heart. The ladies. Right, Doc Wilson added from his seat. I've known him longer than most, known what he was capable of. But I've also seen him gentle horses no one else could touch. Seen him sit with dying men through the night, easing their passing. That's the measure of a man, not how fast he can draw. Mayor Collins raised his hands for quiet. The town council has reached a decision. We're offering you the marshal's badge, Mr. Hawkins. Red Rock needs a lawman. Someone who knows the difference between justice and vengeance. Hawkins studied the badge the mayor held out. Silver star catching lamplight, carrying the weight of everything he'd tried to leave behind. No! The word fell like a stone in still. Water. Confusion rippled through the crowd. But we need protection, Peterson protested. After tonight, every gunslinger looking to make a name will be headed here, looking for the Ghost. That's exactly why I won't wear the badge. Hawkins moved forward, his presence filling the room. A marshal's job is to uphold the law. But the moment I put on that star, this town becomes a target. Every killer, every outlaw wanting to prove themselves, they'll come. Not for justice, but for blood. He turned, meeting the eyes of the townspeople who'd given him sanctuary these past years. You don't need a ghost. You need a community. Need to stand together. Watch out for each other. Like you did tonight. Everyone playing their part, from Tommy being brave enough to trust me, to Doc Wilson patching up men who'd have killed him without blinking. The mayor still held out the badge. Then help us, train Deputy Williams, teach us to protect ourselves. You don't have to wear the star to show us the way. Hawkins was quiet for a long moment. I'll teach what I can. Help where I'm needed. But understand this, violence is like a disease. Once it takes root, it spreads. What happened tonight was necessary, but it can't become who we are. He looked at Sarah, saw understanding in her eyes. 5 years ago, you gave me something precious, peace, a chance to be more than my reputation. Now it's my turn to give something back. I'll help this town stay strong, but not through fear, through community, through standing together against whatever comes. The mayor nodded slowly, lowering the badge. And if trouble finds us again? A ghost of a smile touched Hawkins' lips. Then they'll learn what those 5 men learned tonight, that this town has teeth, even if they're hidden behind a smile. As the meeting broke up, people lingered, watching Hawkins with new eyes. They saw both the quiet man who'd lived among them and the legend he carried within. But more importantly, they saw the choice he made, to stand with them not as a fearsome gunslinger, but as a neighbor, a teacher, a friend. The lines had been drawn. Not between past and present, but between violence and peace, between being feared and being respected. Hawkins had chosen his path, and Red Rock would follow its own way forward, stronger for knowing the true nature of the quiet man who'd chosen to call it home. Marshal Davis arrived from Tucson the next morning, bringing with him news that changed everything. Hawkins found him at the jail, studying the wounded prisoners through steel bars with cold professional eyes. "Impressive work," Davis said without turning. 5 of the meanest killers in the territory, all breathing, all headed for proper justice. He finally faced Hawkins, and there was something in his expression that set off warning bells. "Need to talk to you. Private." They walked to the sheriff's office, where Davis pulled a worn wanted poster from his saddlebags. The face sketched on it was younger, cleaner, but unmistakably Raven's. "His real name's Jacob Hawkins," Davis said quietly. "Your brother's boy." The words hit like physical blows. Hawkins sank into a chair, memories flooding back. His brother, Thomas, wild and reckless, riding off to chase glory in the war. The letter that came after, speaking of a wife, a son. Then nothing for 20 years. "That's why he survived El Paso," Davis continued. "You recognized something in him, didn't you? Something familiar in those eyes. Couldn't bring yourself to end it." "Didn't know." Hawkins' voice was rough as sandpaper. "Thomas never... We hadn't spoken since he left. When I took down the Cortez gang, the boy was just another outlaw. He knows." Davis tossed another paper on the desk. A letter written in a practiced hand. "Found this in Sweetwater. It's why he came here. Not just to kill the ghost, but to kill his uncle, make it personal." Hawkins read the letter slowly. Each word was a knife twisting in his gut. Thomas had died in prison, serving time for a stagecoach robbery. His last words to his son had been about his brother, the famous lawman who'd chosen duty over family. "All these years," Hawkins whispered, "he's been carrying this hate, building it, making himself into everything I spent my life fighting against." "There's more," Davis hesitated. "That bank robbery they're planning, it's not about money. Jacob's got something bigger in mind, something that'll destroy everything you've built here." Before Davis could elaborate, Deputy Williams burst in. "Sir, prisoners are asking for you. Say they've got something you need to hear." At the jail, Raven, Jacob, sat on his bunk, arm in a sling, eyes burning with a fever Hawkins now recognized. Thomas's eyes, when the war fever had taken him. "Finally figured it out, did you?" Jacob's smile was a slash of white in the cell's shadows. "Why I had to be the one to bring you down, why it had to be personal. Your father was weak," Jacob spat, "let himself be taken alive. Rotted in prison while his own brother hunted men across the territories, building his legend." He leaned forward. "But I'm not weak, and what's coming will prove it. Will make the ghost nothing but a cautionary tale." "What's coming?" Hawkins asked, but he already knew he wouldn't get an answer. "You'll see. Soon." Jacob's laugh held madness and triumph. "You took my father from me. Now I'm going to take everything from you. Your home, your peace, your precious town's innocence. By sunset tomorrow, Red Rock will burn, and everyone will know that blood betrayed blood." The other prisoners stirred uneasily. Something in their eyes told Hawkins they knew what was coming. Something worse than a simple bank robbery. "Still, time to end this," Hawkins said quietly. "Your family..." "Family," Jacob's voice cracked like a whip. "Family died in a prison cell while you played hero. I'm not family. I'm just the ghost that's come to haunt the ghost." Hawkins left the jail with Davis, both men troubled. The marshal spoke first. "He's planned something. Something big. Those men in there, they're not his whole gang. Just the ones he sacrificed. To get close to you." "The bank robbery's a distraction," Hawkins agreed. "But from what?" Sarah Mitchell approached, concern etching her features. "James, Emma's teacher, said she saw riders last night. Up by the old mine. said they were carrying dynamite, and suddenly Hawkins understood. The bank, the jail, the wounded prisoners, all of it a complex web to divide the town's attention. While everyone watched the obvious threat, something far worse was taking shape in the shadows. "He's not planning to rob the bank," Hawkins said grimly. "He's going to collapse the mine shafts under the town. Bring all of Red Rock down into the earth." The weight of it settled like a burial shroud. His own blood, twisted by hate and loss, was planning not just murder but apocalypse. And Hawkins had to decide. Could he do what he should have done in El Paso? Could he end his brother's legacy once and for all? The ghost of Thomas seemed to watch him, judging his choices. Yesterday's violence had been clean, professional, but tomorrow's justice would have to be personal. Blood against blood, with a town's survival hanging in the balance. The old mine's entrance gaped like an open grave in the mountainside. Hawkins stood at its mouth, studying tracks in the dust, while Marshal Davis and Deputy Williams held their horses nervous in the growing dark. "At least 20 men," Hawkins said quietly. "Working in shifts, carrying heavy loads inside. They've been at this for days while we watch the obvious threats." "Smart," Davis admitted. "Get us all focused on the bank, the prisoners. Meanwhile, they're hollowing out the ground beneath our feet." "How bad?" Williams asked, young face pale in the twilight. "Town's built over 3 major mine shafts," Hawkins replied. "Collapse them right, everything goes down. Buildings, people, evidence, all buried in one moment." A pebble skittered down the slope, making their horses snort. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, but it wasn't quite right. Too regular, too precise. "Signals," Hawkins whispered. "They're watching. Us have been since we rode up. Trap?" Davis's hand drifted to his gun. "No." Hawkins's voice was cold with certainty. "Jacob wants me to know, wants me to understand what's coming and be unable to stop it." They rode back to town through deepening shadows, each lost in thought. Red Rock's lights twinkled below like earthbound stars, its people unaware of the doom being crafted beneath their feet. At the jail, they found Sarah Mitchell waiting with coffee and grim news. "Bank telegram came," she said, passing Hawkins a paper. "Stage arrives tomorrow noon, carrying twice the usual payroll for the mining company." "Perfect timing," Davis growled. "Hit the bank while the charges go off. Chaos covers their escape." "No," Hawkins studied the telegram. "That's not Jacob's play. This isn't about money, it's about legacy, about proving he's more ghost than the ghost." Inside the cells, the prisoners watched with predators' eyes. Jacob sat in shadows, his quiet laugh carrying across the room. "Finally piecing it together, Uncle? Finally seeing the shape of things?" "Why?" Hawkins approached the cell. "Why take innocent lives? This is between us." "Because that's what you do," Jacob surged forward, face pressed against the bars. "You save people, protect the innocent. But tomorrow you'll have to choose. The bank full of good citizens or the mines full of dynamite. Save one, lose the other, and everyone will know that the great ghost couldn't save them all." "Could end it now," Davis suggested quietly. "Accident in the cells, clean, quick. And prove him right?" Hawkins turned away. "Prove that violence is the only answer?" Sarah touched his arm gently. "James, sometimes violence finds us, no matter how we try to avoid it." "That's what he's counting on." Hawkins's voice carried decades of weight. "Pushing me until I become what he believes I am, just another killer with a fancy reputation." He walked outside, into the quiet street. Red Rock slept uneasily, perhaps sensing the shadow hanging over it. Tomorrow would bring violence, one way or another. The only question was what kind of violence, the clean, professional kind he'd shown in the saloon, or the personal, brutal kind Jacob wanted to draw out of him. "I knew Thomas was lost," he said to the night air. "Knew the war had broken something in him, but I never looked for his boy. Never thought about what that broken man might teach his son." Sarah joined him, her presence steady as always. The sins of the fathers and the uncles. Hawkins watched shadows move between buildings, townspeople setting up the defenses he'd taught them. I've spent 30 years trying to bring justice to the territories. Now my own blood wants to destroy everything I've built. Not just lives, but the very idea that justice can exist without vengeance. And what will you do? The question hung in the air like gun smoke. In the jail, Jacob waited, certain his uncle would eventually prove to be just another gunman with a body. Count. In the mines, men worked through the night, planting the seeds of destruction, and somewhere between justice and vengeance, a ghost searched for answers. "I'll do what I've always done," Hawkins said finally. "Protect the innocent, uphold the law." He turned to Sarah, his eyes carrying the weight of tomorrow's choices. "Even if it means burying the last of my family to do it." The night grew deeper, stars wheeling overhead. In a few hours, sun would rise on a day of reckoning, blood against blood, justice against vengeance, with a town's survival hanging in the balance, and all the while Jacob's words echoed. Could the ghost save them all? Or would he finally have to choose between being a legend and being human? Dawn found Hawkins in the jail again, sitting quietly across from Jacob's cell. Neither man had slept, uncle and nephew, ghost and shadow, locked in a silent battle of wills. "You know what's funny?" Jacob's voice carried the edge of madness that came with exhaustion. "Father used to tell me stories about you, the great James Hawkins, bringing law to the lawless territories. Never mentioned how you left him to rot." "Your father made his choices," Hawkins replied softly, "just like you've made yours." "My choice?" Jacob laughed, a broken sound. "Was to be better than either of you. You with your rigid justice, him with his weakness. I chose to become something new, something that would make the ghost look like a bedtime story." Marshal Davis entered, boots heavy on wooden floors. "Stage is on schedule. Bank's getting nervous, and we found more tracks up by the mine, fresh ones." Hawkins didn't look away. "From Jacob. How many men you got up there, nephew? How many souls you willing to sacrifice for your revenge?" "Enough." Jacob's smile was a knife in the shadows. "Enough to make sure that whatever you choose to save today, you lose something else." The great protector, finally forced to admit he can't protect everyone. Sarah Mitchell's arrival carried the scent of coffee and common sense. She'd brought breakfast, but her eyes were troubled. "Town's getting restless," she reported. "Words spreading about movement in the mines. People are scared." "Good." Jacob's voice carried satisfaction. "Let them be scared. Let them know that their safety, their peace, was always an illusion, that it only took one man who wasn't afraid of the ghost to bring it all down." "You're wrong." Hawkins stood slowly. "This town's peace isn't built on fear of me. It's built on people standing together, looking out for each other, something you never learned." Pretty words. Jacob pressed against the bars. "But when the charges blow, when the bank's being robbed, when everything's burning, will pretty words save them? Or will you have to become what you really are? A killer, just like me. Just like father," Deputy Williams burst in, face flushed. "Riders spotted north of town, at least 10 men moving fast." The game was moving into its final phase. Jacob's smile widened as Hawkins turned to Davis and Williams. "Get the townspeople to the church," Hawkins ordered. "Highest ground, strongest building. Sarah, help Doc Wilson set up for casualties. And send Tommy up to the bell tower. We'll need those eyes." "Running out of time, Uncle," Jacob called. "Noon's coming, stage is coming, choices are coming. Which will it be? The bank full of citizens? The mine full of dynamite? Or maybe these? Cells? Going to kill your own blood to save strangers?" Hawkins paused at the door. "There's always another choice, Jacob. Always a way that doesn't end in blood. That's where you're wrong." Jacob's voice dropped to a whisper. "This was always going to end in blood. The only question is, how much?" Outside, the town was waking. to tension. People hurried through streets, casting fearful glances at the mines looming above. Shopkeepers barred windows, farmers brought in stock. Everyone could feel it, the shadow of violence stretching across their peaceful valley. "He's right about one thing," Davis said, checking his guns. "Can't be everywhere at once. Bank, mines, jail. Something has to give. That's what he's counting on." Hawkins watched the sun climb higher, each minute bringing them closer to reckoning. "Forcing a choice between duty and blood, making me prove I'm either a heartless lawman or a weak hypocrite." Sarah touched his arm. "You're neither. You're the man who taught us to protect ourselves, to stand together." And there it was, the piece Jacob hadn't counted on. In his obsession with destroying the ghost, he'd forgotten about the community that had given a tired gunman peace. A community that had learned more from Hawkins than just how to shoot. "Get everyone ready," Hawkins said finally. "Not just for evacuation, but for defense. Jacob thinks he's forcing me to choose between saving some and sacrificing others." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Time to show him there's always another way." The sun climbed higher, burning away morning shadows. In his cell, Jacob watched with predator's eyes as Red Rock prepared for battle. He thought he was forcing his uncle into an impossible choice, but he'd forgotten the first lesson the ghost had learned in 30 years of bringing law to the territories. The deadliest force wasn't a fast gun or a clever plan. It was good people standing together, refusing to let darkness win. The truth came from an unexpected source. As the town prepared for noon's reckoning, stone-faced Jones called for Hawkins. The outlaw's face was drawn with pain, and something else, fear. "Need to tell you something," Jones whispered when Hawkins approached his cell. "About Jacob, about what really happened in El Paso." Marshal Davis moved closer, while Sarah paused in her bandage preparations. Even Jacob, in his cell, went still as death. "Shut up, Jones." Jacob's voice carried deadly warning. "Remember your oath." But Jones shook his head. "Been carrying this too long. Your uncle needs to know, needs to understand what this is really about." "Your father didn't die in prison, Jacob." Jones's words fell like hammer blows in the quiet jail. "He escaped, changed his name, became someone else." He paused, looking at Hawkins. "Became a lawman." The world seemed to tilt beneath Hawkins' feet. "What?" "Thomas Hawkins died, sure enough. But Marshal Richard Davis was born." Every eye turned to Davis, who stood frozen in the doorway. The marshal's hand had dropped to his gun, his face a mask of fury. "You swore an oath," he snarled at Jones. "To your dying breath you swore." But Hawkins was already seeing it, the pieces falling into place. The familiar way Davis moved, the ghost of Thomas in his features beneath the beard and weather-worn. "Here's, brother," Hawkins whispered. Davis, Thomas, drew his gun with snake-like speed. "Back away from the cells, James. This isn't how I wanted it, but Jones here just forced my hand." "You're working with Jacob," Hawkins said, understanding dawning like a cold sun. "All of it. The bank robbery, the mine, the choice. It was both of you." 18 years wearing a badge. Thomas's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Learning how lawmen think, how they act, planning how to destroy everything my righteous brother built." Jacob's silence had turned to savage glee. "Surprise, Uncle. Family reunion's gotten interesting, hasn't it?" "The stage," Hawkins said slowly. "It's not carrying payroll at all, is it?" "Oh, it's carrying something." Thomas's smile matched his. "Sons. Enough dynamite to turn Red Rock into a memory. While you're choosing between the bank and the mine, the real destruction drives right into town." Sarah backed toward the door. "I'll warn them." "You'll stay right there," Thomas commanded. "Everyone plays their part today, even the woman foolish enough to give my brother a chance at peace." But Sarah Mitchell wasn't the same woman who'd welcomed a tired gunman 5 years ago. As Thomas's attention shifted to her, she hurled the basin of bandages into his face. The distraction was tiny, A split second at most. It was enough. Hawkins moved like his namesake, flowing between Thomas's gun and Sarah. His left hand pushed her toward the door, while his right swept his coat back, but he didn't draw. "Run!" he shouted to Sarah. "Warn the town!" Thomas's gun barked, the bullet splitting air where Sarah had stood. She was already gone, boots pounding on wooden walkways. "Still slow on the left side," Hawkins said quietly. "Just like when we were boys." "Draw the gun, James." Thomas's voice was ice. "Let's finish what started in El Paso. Show my boy what a real killer looks like." But Hawkins kept his hand away from his holster. "All these years, Thomas, all this planning. And for what? To prove. I should have chosen blood over justice. To prove you're just like us," Jacob called from his cell. "A killer hiding behind a badge. Behind words like justice and law. But today everyone sees the truth. The ghost can't save them all. Not the town, not the woman, not even his own blood." Outside, the church bell began to ring, Sarah's warning carrying across Red Rock. Thomas's face twisted. "Doesn't matter," he said. "Too late to stop what's coming. Draw your gun, brother. Die like the legend you pretend to be." "No." Hawkins's voice carried the weight of decades. "You want me to choose between blood and duty? I choose both. Because that's what you never understood, Thomas. Real justice isn't about killing. It's about giving even the worst men a chance to choose better." "Then you choose death." Thomas's finger tightened on the trigger. "Goodbye, brother." The sound of the shot filled the jail like thunder. Thunder echoed in the jail. But Hawkins still stood. Thomas's gun had blown splinters from the doorframe, his shot thrown off by something no one had noticed. Deputy Williams, coming up behind him with a piece of firewood. Thomas went down hard, his gun skittering across wooden floors. In their cells, Jacob and his men erupted in curses. "Figured it out an hour ago," Williams said, standing over Thomas with his gun drawn. "Way he moved, way he gave orders. No marshal I ever met acted that much like he was playing a part." Hawkins knelt beside his brother, checking for a pulse. "Alive, get him secured before—" The rest was lost in explosion. The ground shook as dynamite. "Turn the north mine shaft into hell." Through the window, they saw flames and smoke rising above the town. "That's not possible," Jacob snarled, pressing against his cell bars. "The charges weren't set to blow yet." "No," Hawkins agreed, retrieving Thomas's gun. "They weren't. But Sarah didn't just warn the town. She warned the men I posted in the mines 3 days ago. Men who've been watching, waiting, replacing your dynamite with something less dangerous." Understanding dawned in Jacob's eyes. The ghost was ghosting us all along. "Learned from El Paso," Hawkins said quietly. "Learned to look deeper, to see the layers of a trap. The moment Jones mentioned Thomas, I knew there had to be more. My brother was always clever, but he taught you too well, Jacob. Made you want to be seen, want to be known." Through the windows came the sound of gunfire, Red Rock citizens defending their town against riders who'd expected chaos and found preparation instead. "The stage," Thomas groaned from the floor, where Williams was binding his hands. "You can't stop it all." "Already have." Hawkins checked his pocket watch. "Stage was stopped 10 miles out. Marshal Davis, the real Davis, is probably loading your explosives into a ravine right now." More gunfire, but it was becoming sporadic. Without the mine explosion to cover them, without the stage's arrival to distract the town, Jacob's men were riding into a prepared defense. "All that planning," Hawkins continued, "all that hate. And you forgot the most important lesson I ever learned. A man's real strength isn't in his gun, but in the people who trust him." "Trust?" Jacob laughed, but there was desperation in it. "Now, they'll never trust you again, not after learning what your own blood was willing to do. Every time they look at you, they'll remember this day. Remember that death follows the ghost like a shadow." "Maybe." Hawkins moved to the window, watching smoke clear from the controlled explosion. But they'll also remember how a community stood together, how good people chose to fight darkness instead of fearing it. Sarah appeared in the doorway, face smudged with smoke but eyes bright. Riders are retreating, 3 captured rest running. For the hills, no casualties except pride and a few fence posts. The mines. Doc Wilson says the explosion was mostly smoke. Your men got most of the dynamite out last night. Damage is minimal. Hawkins nodded, turning back to his brother and nephew. In their faces, he saw the same realization. Their perfect plan, years in the making, had been undone not by the ghost's guns, but by the very thing they'd tried to destroy. A community's trust in one of its own. "What now?" Thomas asked, his voice heavy with defeat. "Going to kill us after all? Finish what you started in El Paso?" "No." Hawkins' voice was gentle. "Going to do what I should have done back then. Give you a chance. To face justice. To find a way back to the light if you can." Outside, the sun had reached its zenith. Noon had come to Red Rock, not with the bang of violence Jacob had planned, but with the quiet triumph of good people standing together. The ghost, it seemed, had learned one last lesson. Sometimes the best way to fight darkness wasn't with more darkness, but with the light of trust and community. Victory had come too easily. Hawkins felt it in his bones as he watched Williams and 2 deputies escort Thomas to a reinforced cell. 20 years of hate, a decade of planning. Men like his brother didn't just accept defeat. "Something's wrong," he said quietly to Sarah, who stood beside him at the window. "This isn't over." "The explosion failed," she replied. "The stage is stopped. Their men are scattered." And they're both smiling. It was true. Thomas and Jacob watched from their cells with the patient eyes of predators. No rage at their failure, no despair at capture. Just waiting. The first hint came from Tommy Wilson in the church tower. "Riders coming from the south this time, at least 20 men. Hawkins's hand dropped to his gun. "How many men did you really have, Jacob?" "Enough." His nephew's smile widened. "Did you think El Paso was the only gang we had connections with? That Thomas spent 18 years as a marshal without making friends?" The truth hit like a physical blow. "You sent word out to every outlaw gang in the territory. Told them the ghost was vulnerable," Thomas called from his cell. "That Red Rock was ripe for taking. That today was the day the legend died." More warnings came, riders approaching from east and west. The scattered remnants of Jacob's first force regrouping, joined by fresh guns drawn by the chance to make history. "How many?" Sarah's voice was tight. "Doesn't matter," Hawkins replied. "Town's warned now. Prepared, we can..." "Can what?" Jacob laughed. "Stop 50 gunmen? 100? Every killer and cutthroat in 3 territories is coming, Uncle. Coming to see the ghost fall. Coming to be part of the story." He was right. Red Rock could fight off 1 gang, maybe 2. But this was something else. This was every dark thing. Hawkins had spent his life fighting, drawn to his home like vultures to carrion. "Get everyone to the church," he ordered Sarah. "Highest ground, strongest walls. Williams, bring the prisoners. We're not leaving them here for their friends to..." "Free running," Thomas taunted. "The great ghost finally showing fear." "No." Hawkins checked his gun with practiced hands. "Just choosing better ground." They moved through streets already emptying as townspeople hurried to the church. Hawkins saw his lessons bearing fruit, families moving in organized groups, armed citizens, covering their retreat, everything calm and coordinated. At the church steps, Doc Wilson waited with his medical bag. "Like old times, eh? You against an army?" "Not against," Hawkins corrected. Between them and innocent people. Only place I've ever belonged." Inside, the church's main hall had been transformed. Pews created barricades, windows were manned by determined citizens with rifles. Sheriff Collins supervised it all, turning a house of worship into a fortress. "Riders are holding at town limits," Tommy reported from the bell tower. "Gathering strength. Must be 40, 50 of them now." Williams locked Thomas and Jacob in the church basement, their smiles never wavering. They knew what was coming. A siege, a slaughter, a legend's last stand. "You can still walk away," Sarah said softly. "No one would blame you. This isn't your fight anymore." Hawkins watched the sun begin its westward descent. In a few hours, darkness would give the outlaws cover to attack. Darkness, when ghosts were supposed to be strongest. "Everything I've done," he said finally, "every life I've taken, every man I've brought to justice was leading to this. Not just protecting the innocent, but teaching them to protect themselves." He turned to the armed citizens manning their posts, shopkeepers, farmers, ranchers, good people who'd learned to stand against evil. "Jacob thinks he's brought an army to destroy a legend, but he's about to learn what I learned 5 years ago." Hawkins checked his gun one final time. "A community that stands together is stronger than any gang of killers." The sun touched the mountains, painting red rock in shades of blood and gold. Soon darkness would come, and with it the final test of everything Hawkins believed in, not just his skill with a gun, but his faith in good people standing together against the dark. Darkness fell like a burial shroud over Red Rock. The first attack came with it, a probing raid from the south, 10 riders shooting up the street. They found empty buildings and deadly accuracy from the church's defenders. 4 down, Tommy reported from the bell tower. "Rest are falling back." But it was just the beginning. More riders emerged from the darkness, using buildings for cover. Gunfire lit up the night like lightning, lead splitting the air around the church. "They're testing our positions," Hawkins said, watching from a window, looking for weak spots. A massive explosion rocked the north side of town, the outlaws using dynamite to create a diversion. In the basement, Jacob laughed. "Hear that, Uncle? That's the sound of your perfect little town burning." "Save your breath," Hawkins replied, calmly. "You'll need it to explain to a judge why 50 men died following your revenge plot." But Jacob's smile never wavered. 50 men, look again. More riders were appearing, drawn by the gunfire and flames. Not just outlaws now, but every dark soul with a gun and a grudge. The legend of the ghost had spread too far, drawn too many, who wanted to make their name by ending his. "Main force gathering on Baker Street," Tommy called down. "At least 30 men. They're bringing up a wagon. Looks like a battering ram." Sarah handed out ammunition with steady hands. "How long can we hold?" "Long enough." Hawkins checked his gun. "Williams, take 10 men to the north windows. Doc, get the women and children to the basement, except for those who can shoot. Sheriff, cover the south entrance. Everyone else, choose your positions and remember your training." The church bell rang out, Tommy's warning that the main attack was coming. Outside, a voice carried through the darkness. "Send out the ghost!" someone shouted. "Give us Hawkins, and we'll let the rest of you live." "They're lying," Thomas called. From below, "Everyone in that church is marked for death. Your last gift to these people, brother, making them die for your legend." But when Hawkins looked at the defending townspeople, he saw no fear. These weren't helpless victims waiting for a legend to save them. These were proud citizens protecting their home. The wagon hit the church doors like thunder, wood splintering but holding. Gunfire erupted from every window, cutting down the men manning the ram. But more came, using their fallen comrades as cover. "North wall's breached," Williams shouted. "They're coming in!" Hawkins moved like his namesake, a ghost in the darkness. His first shot took down the lead attacker. His second dropped a man trying to throw dynamite. Every bullet found its mark, but there were so many targets. Sarah's rifle cracked beside him, dropping an outlaw climbing through a window. Doc Wilson, hands that usually healed, now dealing death, guarded the basement stairs. Even young Tommy had traded his lookout post for a firing position, showing the same steady aim Hawkins had taught him. But the attackers kept coming. Lead filled the air, smoke turning the church into a vision of hell. A bullet creased Hawkins's arm, another took his hat. Still he moved, Still he fought, becoming the legend they'd all heard about. Then Jacob's voice cut through the chaos. "The prisoners are loose!" Somehow, in the confusion, Thomas had gotten free. Now he stood in the basement doorway, holding Sarah. As a shield, Jacob grinning beside him with a stolen gun. "Choose, brother," Thomas shouted. "The woman who gave you peace, or the townspeople who gave you purpose." Time slowed. Hawkins saw it all with crystal clarity. Sarah's calm face, Jacob's triumphant smile, Thomas's desperate eyes. This was the moment they'd planned for, the impossible choice they'd created, but they'd forgotten something crucial. "Sarah," Hawkins said quietly, "show them what I taught you." She moved like he'd shown her, turning into Thomas's grip instead. Of away. Her elbow found his solar plexus as her heel crushed his instep. Jacob's shot went wide as Williams and Doc opened fire from prepared positions. 5 seconds, like in the saloon, but different. This time Hawkins wasn't alone in the dance. When it ended, Thomas and Jacob were down, wounded but alive. Outside, the attackers fell back, shocked by the coordinated defense. The legend they'd come to destroy hadn't been one man, but an entire town. "It's over," Hawkins said to his fallen brother. "The ghost never was just one man. It was the idea that good people standing together are stronger than any evil." The night wasn't finished. More battles would come before dawn. But something had changed in Red Rock. A legend had become something greater. A community had learned to be its own ghost. Dawn painted Red Rock in shades of gold and smoke. The night's battle had left its marks, bullet holes in buildings, scorched walls from dynamite, brass cartridges scattered like fallen leaves, but the town still stood, and its people with it. Hawkins walked the streets slowly, counting costs. 23 outlaws dead, twice that many wounded or captured. Among the townspeople, a few injuries but no lives lost. Doc Wilson had been busy through the night, treating friend and foe alike with steady hands. "Riders spotted heading south," Tommy reported, still at his post despite exhaustion. "What's left of them anyway? Looks like they've had enough of ghosts." In the jail, now crowded with prisoners, Thomas and Jacob sat in separate cells. The fight had gone out of them, replaced by something Hawkins recognized. The hollow look of men whose vengeance had turned to ash. "Should have killed us," Thomas said quietly as Hawkins approached. "Left us in the church. Let your townspeople do what needed doing." "That's where you were wrong," Hawkins replied. "About them. About me. Real strength isn't in how many men you can kill. It's in choosing not to, even when you have every right." Sarah appeared with coffee and fresh bandages. The cut on her arm from the basement fight had been neatly stitched by Doc, but she moved without favoring it. Another thing she'd learned, how to work through pain. "Marshal Davis, the real one, just rode in," she reported. "Says he'll take the prisoners to Yuma himself. Make sure they stand trial proper." Jacob laughed bitterly from his cell. Trial? For what? Failing to kill the great ghost? For proving that one man's legend can poison everything he touches? No. Hawkins took the coffee Sarah offered, for forgetting that a man's real legacy isn't in the lives he takes, but in the ones he changes. "Look around, Jacob. See what your revenge plot really revealed." Through the jail window they could see Red Rock coming back to life. Townspeople working together to repair damage, help wounded, restore their community. Not with fear or desperation, but with the quiet pride of those who'd faced darkness and stood firm. "You wanted to destroy everything I built," Hawkins continued, "to prove I was just another killer with a fancy name. Instead you proved something else, that one man's choice to change, to teach instead of threaten, could change an entire town." "Mighty pretty words," Thomas growled. "But when the bullets flew, you still killed. Still showed them the ghost they came to see." "Did I?" Hawkins smiled slightly. "Count the dead, brother. Look how they fell. Your men shot to kill, wild, desperate. Our people shot to wound, to stop, just like I taught them. Even in the worst of it, they remembered that justice isn't about revenge. Sarah touched his arm gently. Town council's meeting. They want to talk about rebuilding, about making sure. Nothing like this happens again. It won't, Hawkins said with quiet certainty. The word will spread. Not about the ghost and his fast gun, but about a town that stood together. That turned outlaws and killers away, not through fear, but through unity. He looked at his brother and nephew one last time. That's the real legacy I'm leaving. Not the legend of one man, but the truth of what good people can do when they stop waiting for heroes and become their own. Outside, the sun climbed higher, burning away gunsmoke and shadows. Red Rock was wounded but unbowed, its people forever. Changed by the night's crucible. They had faced the darkness and emerged stronger, not because of one legendary gunman, but because they had learned to be their own heroes. The ghost, it seemed, had taught his final lesson, that the strongest force in the world wasn't a fast gun or a fearsome reputation, but a community that refused to let evil win. A week after the battle, Marshal Davis led a wagon train of prisoners toward Yuma. Thomas and Jacob rode in the last wagon, heading to face justice in the same prison where this story had begun. Hawkins watched them go from the steps of the Silver Dollar Saloon, the place where everything had changed. Think they'll ever understand? Sarah asked, standing beside him, what you were really trying to teach us all these years. Maybe. Hawkins touched the fresh paint covering bullet holes in the saloon's wall. Prison gives a man time to think, to choose who he wants to be. Red Rock had changed. Not just the repaired buildings or the new defensive positions citizens had built. There was a quiet confidence in the way people walked the streets now. They'd faced the worst that evil men could bring and stood their ground. The town council had offered him the marshal's badge again. This time, their reasons were different. Not because we need a legend to protect us, Mayor Collins had said, but because we need a teacher to remind us what we learned, that strength isn't in fear, but in standing together. Hawkins had taken the badge this time, not to be the ghost, but to be something more important, a reminder that every person could choose a better way. Tommy Wilson appeared, wearing a deputy's star that seemed too big for his young chest. Stage is coming, Marshal, right on schedule. Then let's welcome them proper, Hawkins replied. Show them what kind of town Red Rock has become. As they walked toward the stage depot, Hawkins saw his lessons everywhere. Citizens nodding to each other with quiet confidence. Shopkeepers who'd learned to watch for trouble while building community. Farmers and ranchers who now knew that together they could face any darkness. You know what they're saying? Sarah fell into step beside him. All across the territory, words spreading. Not about the ghost anymore, but about a town where good people stand together. Where justice means more than just a fast gun. The stage arrived in a cloud of dust. Passengers peering nervously at the town they'd heard so much about. But instead of a bullet-riddled battleground, they found something else. A community that had learned to be its own legend. 5 minutes, Hawkins mused, remembering his warning in the saloon that seemed so long ago. That's all it took to start this story. But the real story wasn't in those minutes of violence. It was in the 5 years of teaching, learning, building something stronger than fear. The sun climbed high over Red Rock, painting the town in light rather than shadow. A fitting symbol, Hawkins thought, for a place that had chosen to face darkness. With unity rather than vengeance, the ghost would always be part of him, a skill set ready if truly needed. But his real legacy wasn't in the notches on his gun or the legends whispered around campfires. It was in the eyes of every citizen who'd learned that true strength came not from fearing the darkness, but from standing together in the light. Some legends, after all, were built not on how many men you could kill, but on how many you could teach to live better.